The call came on a Thursday afternoon, just as the sunlight hit my kitchen window the way it had for 43 years, and just like that, I knew something was wrong. My name is Harold Grant. At 68, I've earned my quiet life in this modest suburban home in Raleigh. 10 years a widower after Margaret lost her battle with cancer, I've settled into rhythms that keep me sane. Mornings in the garden, where the soil remembers my fingers. Afternoons lost in historical fiction. Evenings recording memories for a memoir no one might ever read. The only true light in my life is Emily, my 10-year-old granddaughter. That child has a laugh that could melt February ice, and when she visits every Saturday, I remember what genuine smiles feel like on my face. So when my son Brandon's name flashed on my caller ID that afternoon, my stomach tightened. Our relationship has been strained. Civil, but with boundaries I've had to fortify over years of financial rescues and broken promises. Dad, how's retirement treating you? Brandon's voice carried that familiar warmth that always preceded an ask. At 42, my son still hadn't learned subtlety. Just fine, I said, settling into my armchair. How's the sales job going? Crushing it, he said too quickly. Listen, we've been planning something special, a surprise retirement gift, from the whole family. I waited. There's always a pause before the hook. A 7-day Caribbean cruise, first-class cabins, gourmet dining, the works. You deserve it, Dad. When you've spent decades as a financial advisor, you develop an ear for what's unsaid, the silence where numbers should be. That's very thoughtful, I replied carefully. But I'm not one for big trips these days. Brandon cleared his throat. Well, here's the thing. It's partially booked, but we're short $8,000 to secure everything. The travel agent needs it by Monday, or we lose the deposit. There it was, the real reason for the call. You're a grown man with a job and a family, I said, my voice steady, despite the familiar disappointment rising in my chest. Why am I still funding your life, Brandon? We just want to make memories together, he countered. Emily talks about you constantly. Isn't family worth it? I closed my eyes, seeing Margaret's face. How many times had she warned me? You're not helping him by saving him from consequences. I'll pay for Emily's ticket, I said firmly. Only hers. The warmth in Brandon's voice evaporated like morning dew. You're playing favorites now, trying to buy her affection. That's not what this is. When she asks why her parents couldn't come, he said coldly, I'll tell her to ask you. After he hung up, I sat in silence, remembering the bright-eyed boy who once built model airplanes in our garage. Where had that child gone? When had entitlement hollowed him out? I should have known they wouldn't let it end there. That night, as I was settling in with a book, I heard my front door open. Not a knock, an entrance. They still had the key I'd given them years ago during a home emergency. Brandon and his wife Claire stood in my living room like they owned it. Claire, 40 and perpetually immaculate, dabbed at dry eyes with a tissue while Brandon paced the carpet. We need to talk, he said. Claire looked up, her practiced fragility on full display. Harold, we're drowning. It wasn't $8,000 anymore. It was $60,000 in debt. Credit cards, a second mortgage, overdue loans. Brandon's commissions had been cut 6 months ago for poor performance, though he blamed the economy. Claire, meanwhile, refused to consider downsizing their lifestyle. We need you to co-sign a personal loan, Brandon finally said, using your house as collateral. I felt my chest tighten. That's not going to happen. Claire's demeanor shifted instantly, her vulnerability hardening into something sharp. Emily's smart, Harold. She'll figure out who abandoned her family. Brandon nodded. Maybe it's better if she doesn't go on the cruise at all. Wouldn't want her enjoying it without her parents. I looked at these strangers wearing my family's faces and made my decision. Without a word, I walked to my desk, wrote a check for Emily's cruise ticket only, and handed it to Brandon. He snatched it without thanks. They left as coldly as they came. That night, as I climbed the stairs alone with an empty checkbook in my hand, I didn't yet know that wasn't the last time they would try to take something from me. It was only the beginning. If you ever want to know what love costs, don't look at the moments you gave. It's the receipts you kept, and never dared to total. Sleep eluded me that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Brandon's face, not as the entitled man who'd stormed out of my living room, but as the 5-year-old who once cried when he accidentally stepped on an ant. How do we lose ourselves so completely? At 2 a.m, I gave up on rest and shuffled to my bedroom closet. Behind winter coats and old suits hung a fire-resistant lockbox, the physical archive of my weakness disguised as generosity. I carried it to the kitchen table and clicked open the combination lock. One by one, I laid out the evidence: bank statements, loan agreements, canceled checks, some yellowed with age, others crisp as yesterday's mail. Each one a milestone in Brandon's descent and my enabling. $200,000 for their house down payment 5 years ago. Just until my commission structure changes, Dad. $30,000 for a wedding that could have been done for 1/3 of the cost. $15,000 for a honeymoon in Bali that Claire insisted would set the tone for their marriage. $8,000 for car repairs when Brandon crashed his BMW. $12,000 for Emily's private school that they chose, despite the perfectly good public school down the street. $5,000 for emergency medical costs that mysteriously coincided with Claire's cosmetic procedure. Each loan came with tearful gratitude, each promise of repayment abandoned as soon as the check cleared. Each dollar a slow bleed from my retirement fund, still intact, but considerably thinner than it should have been. I tallied the damage, just over $300,000, nearly 1/3 of what I'd saved during 40 years of disciplined financial planning. Not enough to ruin me, but enough to make me question every decision I'd ever made as a father. Margaret's voice echoed in my memory. We'd been sitting on our back porch, watching Brandon drive away after another emergency loan, this one for business attire he needed for job interviews. One day, she'd said, sipping her tea, he'll see your generosity not as love, but as duty. She was right. She always was. Each time I said yes, the next ask grew bolder. Each time I said no, his anger intensified. I'd created a monster with my own signature at the bottom of checks. The morning of the cruise arrived with clouds threatening rain, fitting for my mood. Brandon's dented SUV pulled into my driveway at precisely 9 o'clock. Emily burst from the back seat like sunshine breaking through storm clouds, clutching her dog-eared copy of Charlotte's Web and a small backpack covered in sparkly unicorns. "Grandpa!" She collided with my legs, face tilted up with unrestrained joy. "We're going on a boat, a giant boat." I hugged her tight, breathing in the scent of strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence. "We sure are, sweetheart." Claire watched from the passenger seat, her designer sunglasses unable to hide her contempt. As I loaded my suitcase into the trunk, she leaned out the window. "Money doesn't buy family, Harold," she said with a smile that never reached her eyes. The 90-minute drive to New York Harbor was an exercise in restraint. Brandon's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel whenever I spoke. Claire peppered her conversation with subtle digs about financial responsibility and family unity. Only Emily seemed oblivious to the tension, her face pressed against the window as Manhattan's skyline emerged on the horizon. "It's like a forest made of mirrors," she whispered in awe. I smiled. That's a poet's way of seeing it. When we finally arrived at the port, the ocean serenity dominated the horizon. 18 decks of gleaming white steel and glass rising from the water like a floating castle. Emily gasped, her hand finding mine and squeezing tight. "It's not a ship. It's a castle," she breathed. Wait until you see inside, I promised. The check-in process revealed the first of what I suspected would be many manipulations. The clerk handed Emily and me golden key cards for a premium suite on Deck 9. Brandon and Claire received standard white cards for an interior cabin on Deck 3. There must be some mistake, Claire said, her voice tight. We're supposed to be in the family suite. The clerk checked her computer. I'm showing that Mr. Grant Sr. specifically requested this arrangement when he paid for the booking. Claire's eyes narrowed behind her sunglasses. She leaned toward Brandon and whispered something that sounded like showing off, but I pretended not to hear. The first few hours on board passed in a blur of exploration. Emily dragged me from the kids' club to the pool deck to the theater, her excitement contagious enough to momentarily ease my worries. We settled in for lunch at the buffet, where she constructed an improbable sandwich of chicken nuggets, pineapple, and chocolate chips. This is the best vacation ever, she declared, chocolate smearing her cheek. I declined the waiter's offer of cocktails, sticking to iced tea and keeping my wits sharp. Perhaps I was being paranoid, but something about Brandon and Claire's acquiescence felt wrong. They'd given up too easily on the $60,000. People that desperate don't just walk away. My instincts proved right that evening. Returning to my suite after dinner with Emily, I found a folded paper that had been slipped under my door. Inside was a photocopy of my home deed, my name and property value circled in red marker. No note. No explanation, just a silent message. We still want this. I sat on the edge of my bed, the paper trembling slightly in my hand. This wasn't about a family vacation. It never had been. The cruise was about access, getting me away from my support network, isolating me in international waters where they could apply pressure without witnesses or consequences. Or, perhaps, something worse. As the ship's horn bellowed and Manhattan faded into mist, I realized I was now alone in the middle of the ocean with two people who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from my disappearance. Some betrayals don't scream. They whisper through thin walls when no one's supposed to be listening. By the third night of our cruise, I'd almost convinced myself I was being paranoid. Emily was thriving, winning art contests at the kids' club, splashing in the pool for hours, even singing Let It Go at karaoke night with surprising gusto for such a shy child. Her joy was infectious, and I found myself relaxing despite my suspicions. Brandon and Claire had been surprisingly scarce. They appeared briefly at breakfast, Claire picking at fruit while Brandon nursed black coffee in silence. Then they'd vanish. Claire to the spa, Brandon to who knows where. When we did interact, they were civil, but distant, as if conserving energy for something else. I assumed their behavior stemmed from financial stress. After all, people drowning in $60,000 of debt tend to be preoccupied. That afternoon, Emily and I sat at the buffet, laughing about her sunburned nose despite the sunscreen I'd religiously applied. You look like Rudolph, I teased, tapping her pink nose. Then you have to be Santa, she replied, giggling as she stole a French fry from my plate. I had no idea how quickly our peaceful vacation would unravel. That evening, Emily realized she'd forgotten her swim goggles in her parents' cabin. She needed them for the next morning's swimming lesson, so I walked her to Deck 3. I waited at the end of the corridor while she used her key card to enter their cabin. 5 minutes passed. Then, 10. Just as I was about to check on her, Emily burst from the room, her face pale and tear-streaked. She ran straight into my arms, trembling. Emily? What's wrong? Are your parents? They're going to hurt you, she whispered, her voice breaking. I heard them. They're going to hurt you tonight. I led her quickly to the nearest sitting area, away from prying eyes. Kneeling to her level, I gently asked, What exactly did you hear, sweetheart? Between sobs, Emily explained. She'd entered the cabin quietly, hearing her parents arguing through the partially open bathroom door. Curious, she'd pause to listen. Mom said, "You want to wait another night? The plan is set." "The deck patrol rotates at 9:30, Emily recited, her small voice eerily mature as she quoted her mother. My blood turned to ice as she continued. Dad said, "I'm just saying. What if the drug doesn't knock him out fully? What if he fights back?" Emily's hands clutched mine. And then Mom said, really cold, "Then you make sure he doesn't get up. This has to look like an accident. Tonight." I kept my expression neutral despite the horror building inside me. "Did they say anything else?" Emily nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "They said they would push you during your walk. The place with no cameras. Mom said nobody would find out until it's too late." "You did exactly the right thing telling me," I assured her, my mind racing through possibilities. "I'm very proud of you." "They said you'd be too sleepy to fight back," Emily whispered. "They're going to do it tonight." I went completely still, processing this information. My own son and his wife weren't just financial parasites. They were planning to murder me, to throw me overboard in international waters where my body might never be found. All for money. I thought of Margaret, of how devastated she would be to know what our son had become. But this was no time for grief. Emily was watching me, terrified, waiting for the adult to make things right. "I promise you," I said with a calmness I didn't feel, "I won't let anything happen to either of us. First, I needed to ensure Emily's safety. I escorted her to the kids' club, speaking quietly with the supervisor to explain that Emily should remain there until I personally came to collect her. No exceptions, not even for her parents. I cited a family disagreement that needed resolving and slipped the woman a $50 bill to emphasize the importance. Back in my suite, I retrieved an old digital voice recorder from my luggage, a habit from my financial advising days when I'd dictate notes while traveling. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose. Just after 9 o'clock, I positioned myself in a crew corridor that ran alongside Brandon and Claire's cabin, a path I'd noticed while exploring the ship's layout earlier. Pressing my ear against the wall where their bathroom would be, I activated the recorder and waited. "Can't mess this up again," Claire was saying, her voice faint but discernible. "We need his signature on those papers before anything happens." "I know the plan," Brandon replied, irritation edging his words. "Deck 8, starboard railing, far end near that observation telescope. He always goes there at the same time." "Push him while he's looking at the horizon," Claire instructed. "Make it quick. One shove, that's all it takes. And if someone sees, nobody will be around." I checked the patrol schedules. There's a 10-minute gap during shift change. Besides, it'll look like an accident. Old man loses his balance. Happens on cruises all the time. I recorded for nearly 15 minutes, capturing every detail of their plan, before slipping away. My hands were steady, but my heart thundered in my chest. The evidence was damning, but I needed official help. The next morning, I requested a private meeting with the ship's head of security. Officer Michael Shaw, a former military man with a no-nonsense demeanor. In his small office tucked behind the purser's desk, I played the recording. Shaw's expression darkened as he listened. "Jesus Christ," he muttered when the recording ended. "I've dealt with theft, assault, even the occasional sexual harassment case on board, but attempted murder? That's a first." "Can you confirm the patrol schedule they mentioned?" I asked. He checked the digital roster on his computer and nodded grimly. "There is indeed a brief gap around 11:30 during shift change. We try to minimize those, but with limited staff." He looked up at me. "Mr. Grant, we should inform the captain immediately and detain your son and daughter-in-law." "Wait," I said, holding up my hand. "I have a different proposal." Shaw's eyebrows shot up. "You're not suggesting—" "I want to catch them in the act," I stated firmly. "With witnesses and no possibility of denial, That's extremely risky. You could die if we're off by seconds. I leaned forward. If I don't confront this directly, I'll never be able to protect my granddaughter from them. And if something happens to me, I tapped the recorder, this becomes public. After considerable argument, Shaw reluctantly agreed to my plan. We spent the next hour mapping out every detail. I would take my usual walk at 11:30 p.m. Location: Deck 8. Far starboard side, the unlit area near the lifeboats. A security team of 3, Shaw and 2 guards, would be stationed in blind spots nearby. I would wear an emergency whistle on a cord under my jacket, and my watch included a panic button linked directly to ship security. The hardest part was saying goodnight to Emily. I tucked her into bed in our suite, brushing her hair from her forehead. "Where are you going?" she asked sleepily, noticing I was still dressed. "Just for a short walk under the stars," I replied. "I'll be right nearby." She hugged me longer than usual. "Promise you'll come back." I nodded but couldn't speak past the lump in my throat. At 11:25 p.m., I left my suite and stepped into the corridor, knowing the next time I returned, I'd either be a man who stopped his own murder or not return at all. I've walked 1,000 decks in my life, but never one where I knew someone would try to kill me before I reached the other side. The night air carried a bite that had nothing to do with temperature. A 3/4 moon cast silver light across the nearly empty deck, creating long shadows that seemed to reach for me like grasping hands. The gentle vibration of engines beneath my feet and the rhythmic sound of waves against the hull would normally have been soothing. Tonight, they only reminded me how far we were from shore, from help, from witnesses, from consequences. I walked slowly, deliberately, with my hands clasped behind my back, just as I had every night since boarding. The weight of the emergency whistle hung against my chest beneath my sweater. My watch, with its hidden panic button, felt unusually heavy on my wrist. I approached the agreed location: starboard railing, sleek metal lifeboats to my right, stacks of deck chairs to my left. Perfect ambush terrain, isolated enough for privacy, but with clear sightlines for Officer Shaw and his men, who I knew were hidden nearby, though I couldn't spot them. I paused at the railing, pretending to study the constellations. My fingers tapped a quiet rhythm against the cold metal, our prearranged signal to Shaw that I was in position. The vast darkness of the Atlantic stretched before me, an endless void that my son intended to make my final resting place. "Couldn't sleep, Dad?" Brandon's voice came from behind me, falsely casual. "Figured you might be here." I turned slowly. Brandon approached from the port side, hands in his pockets, smiling that hollow smile I'd grown to distrust. From the opposite direction came Claire, carrying a steaming mug, her heels clicking softly against the deck. "We brought you some warm cider," Claire said, her voice honey-sweet. "Helps with the nerves out here on the open water." Brandon took the mug from her and extended it to me. "Mom used to make this for you on cold nights. Remember?" The mention of Margaret in this context made my stomach turn, but I kept my expression neutral. I took the mug with steady hands, bringing it to my lips but only pretending to sip. The faint medicinal smell beneath the cinnamon told me all I needed to know about what they'd added to the drink. "Beautiful night," I said, turning back to the sea. "Something about the ocean makes you think about legacy, doesn't it? What we leave behind." "Sure, Dad," Brandon said, edging closer to my left side. Claire drifted to my right, effectively flanking me against the railing. "Emily had such fun today. She's growing up so fast." "She is," I agreed. "Children absorb everything around them, see more than we realize." A pause. I felt the tension rise like a tide. "Funny thing," I continued conversationally. "I saw something interesting on your cabin camera feed earlier today." Brandon stiffened. "What do you mean?" "Oh, I installed a camera in my cabin. For safety. I turned to face them both. You never know who's listening through walls these days. Claire's perfectly composed face cracked. You're bluffing. Am I? I set the drugged cider on the deck beside me. Why would I bluff about something so easy to verify? The pretense collapsed like a house of cards. Brandon lunged suddenly, grabbing my arm with bruising force. You know, Claire hissed. Do it now. As Brandon tried to shove me toward the railing, I triggered the whistle with my free hand and shouted, Security! Everything happened at once. Officer Shaw and 2 guards materialized from their hiding spots, moving with military precision. Brandon released me and tried to flee, but one guard tackled him mid-stride, driving him to the deck with a painful thud. Claire clawed at another guard who attempted to restrain her, screaming about entrapment and betrayal. You set us up, she shrieked, mascara running down her cheeks. This isn't fair. I slumped against the railing, my legs suddenly weak as the adrenaline surge faded. Shaw steadied me with a strong hand on my shoulder. You all right, Mr. Grant? I nodded, unable to speak as I watched my son being handcuffed. Brandon's eyes met mine, not with remorse or shame, but with cold fury, as if I were the one who had betrayed him. In the ship's security office, Brandon and Claire were placed in separate rooms for questioning. Captain Reeves, a stern man with salt and pepper hair and the bearing of someone who had seen everything at sea, reviewed the evidence with Shaw and me. Play the recording again, he ordered, his weathered face grim. Shaw obliged. Claire's clinical instructions and Brandon's hesitant questions filled the small room. When it finished, Captain Reeves shook his head in disgust. In 27 years at sea, I've dealt with drunk passengers jumping overboard, smuggling operations, even a berth in the casino once. But attempted murder? On my ship. He looked at me with genuine sympathy. I'm sorry, Mr. Grant. From the adjacent room, we could hear Claire's shrill protests through the door. That's edited. It's not real. You can manipulate recordings these days. Everyone knows that. Brandon, meanwhile, sat in silent defeat, staring blankly at the wall of his holding room. A thorough search of their cabin yielded more damning evidence. In Brandon's toiletry bag, security found a plastic baggie containing crushed white powder, sleeping pills, ground fine enough to dissolve in hot liquid. More disturbing was the paperwork hidden in the lining of Claire's suitcase. Insurance documents naming Brandon and Claire as my beneficiaries, apparently filed weeks before the cruise. This was premeditated, Shaw said quietly. They even activated a policy under international waters jurisdiction. Less scrutiny that way. Captain Reeves folded his arms across his broad chest. We'll detain them for the remainder of the voyage and contact Bahamian authorities at our next port. Maritime law allows us to transfer them to local police for crimes committed in international waters. I nodded, still processing the reality of my son's betrayal. The clinical calculation of it all, the planning, the forged documents, the cold willingness to end my life, left me hollow. Not yet, I said finally. Both men looked at me in surprise. Mr. Grant, Shaw began cautiously, these people tried to murder you. I'm aware, I replied, but if we arrest them now, Emily loses her parents in a flash, and she deserves more than shock and silence. Instead, I requested Brandon and Claire be confined to their cabin for the remainder of the cruise. All meals would be supervised, and they would have zero contact with Emily. The ship's log would document the incident, preserving the evidence for future legal action. You're a more forgiving man than I would be, Captain Reeves said, clearly disapproving of my leniency. This isn't forgiveness, I assured him. It's calculation. I need time to secure Emily's future before I dismantle theirs. Later that night, I returned to my suite, exhausted but alive. Emily slept peacefully in her bedroom, unaware of how close she'd come to losing her grandfather. As I washed my face, trying to erase the memory of Brandon's hands shoving me toward oblivion, I noticed something white on the floor by my door. A note had been slipped under while I was gone. I unfolded it to find a crude drawing, a stick figure falling over a horizontal line, presumably into water. Written underneath in what I recognized as Claire's precise handwriting, "You got lucky." I held the drawing in my hand as dawn crept over the Atlantic and thought, they're not done with me yet. But this time, I won't just defend, I'll dismantle. You don't always need bars to build a prison. Sometimes, gilt and glass windows are enough. Brandon and Claire were escorted back to their cabin on Deck 3 in silence, flanked by Officer Shaw and a security guard, whose expression suggested he normally handled drunken college students, not would-be murderers. I watched from a distance as Shaw outlined the terms of their confinement. By order of Captain Reeves, you are under ship restriction for the remainder of this voyage, he informed them, his voice carrying the weight of military authority. You are not permitted in any public areas, dining halls, recreation facilities, or retail outlets. All meals will be delivered by security personnel. Your cabin phone will connect only to ship security. Claire's face contorted with rage. This is false imprisonment. You can't just— Ma'am, Shaw cut her off. The alternative is detention in the ship's brig until we dock in Nassau, where you'll be transferred to Bahamian authorities. Your choice. They disappeared into their cabin without another word. The electronic lock was reprogrammed to prevent them from leaving without security override. Afterward, Shaw and I spoke in a quiet corner of the promenade deck. I still think you should press charges immediately, he said, arms crossed. We have the recording, the drugged beverage, the insurance documents. It's airtight. I shook my head, watching the sunrise paint the horizon in shades of orange and gold. I'm not done. This was their first failure. I want them to live in the consequences for a while longer. I requested 3 specific precautions: a total no-contact order with Emily, surveillance inside their cabin recording all conversations, and an official ship log entry documenting the murder attempt in case I needed legal leverage later. Shaw nodded grimly. Consider it done. But I want to be clear. This is unusual protocol. We're only accommodating because of the circumstances. I understand, and I appreciate it. Back in my suite, with Emily still asleep in her bedroom, I stood at the window watching the endless blue expanse of ocean. The triumph I should have felt at foiling their plot was absent, replaced by a hollow ache. I retrieved a small photo album from my luggage, one I always traveled with, and flipped to a page showing Brandon at age 7, proudly holding up a science fair ribbon. I remembered that day, clearly. He'd built a simple electric circuit that lit up different colored bulbs. Nothing revolutionary, but his face had shone with genuine accomplishment. Margaret had taken him for ice cream afterward, and he'd fallen asleep in the back seat on the drive home, sticky-faced and content. Somewhere along the line, he decided taking was easier than building, that the shortest path to what he wanted ran straight through other people's boundaries. Through my heart. I closed the album as Emily emerged, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her unicorn pajamas rumpled. "Morning, Grandpa," she mumbled, climbing onto the couch beside me. "Did you sleep good?" "Well," I corrected automatically. "Did you sleep well?" And yes, I did. The lie came easily for her sake. I hadn't closed my eyes all night. I was determined to shield Emily from the ugliness of what had happened. She knew something was wrong, of course. She'd been the one to overhear the plot. But she didn't need to know that her parents were effectively prisoners, that her father had physically tried to push me overboard. We spent the day snorkeling in turquoise waters near a private island owned by the cruise line. Emily collected colorful shells, spotted a sea turtle, and beat me soundly at poolside trivia. Her laughter felt like salvation, each giggle patching a small hole in my battered spirit. But even children aren't easily fooled. "Why hasn't Mommy called me?" she asked as we ate ice cream cones on the Lido deck. "She always checks on me at least twice a day when I stay with you." "They're under the weather," I said gently. "Just resting, sweetheart." Emily studied my face with those perceptive eyes that missed nothing. "Are they in trouble because of what I heard?" "They're safe," I assured her, which wasn't exactly an answer. "And so are we. That's what matters most." That evening, Shaw showed me selected clips from the surveillance in Brandon and Claire's cabin. The footage was disturbing, not for what they'd done, but for how quickly they'd turned on each other. "You had one job. Push an old man over a rail," Claire hissed, pacing the small cabin like a caged tiger. "One simple shove. How hard is that?" Brandon slumped on the bed. "You always think you're smarter than everyone. Your plan, your timing, your idea about the drink." "Because I am smarter," Claire retorted. "If you'd just followed instructions instead of hesitating." "Don't push me, Claire. I'm not in the mood." She slapped him then, a sharp crack that made him recoil. "Don't push you? That's rich. You couldn't even push your father when it counted." Brandon's face darkened. He grabbed a water glass from the nightstand and hurled it against the wall, where it shattered. "It should have been easy. Now we're screwed." I turned away, unable to watch more. "That's enough." Shaw paused the footage. "There's something else you should know." He pulled out a folder containing printouts of financial records the security team had discovered while searching their belongings. "Claire has a separate bank account in the Cayman Islands," Shaw explained. "From what we can piece together, it's been funded gradually from what Brandon reported to you as business losses." I scanned the documents, recognizing some of the dates and amounts. They aligned perfectly with times Brandon had asked for money to cover work-related expenses. "But that's not all," Shaw continued. "We also found this." He slid over another document, a life insurance policy on Brandon, with Claire as the sole beneficiary. It mirrored almost exactly what they had tried to do to me. "Jesus," I whispered. She was playing him too. Shaw nodded grimly. "You didn't just survive an assassination, Mr. Grant. You dodged a blood feud." Word travels quickly on cruise ships, even without official announcements. By the next day, rumors had spread about the rich couple on Deck 3 being investigated. Staff whispered as they passed their cabin. Other passengers gave curious glances when security delivered their meals. They had become pariahs in their floating prison. I spent the next 2 days preparing for our return to shore. With help from the ship's notary and a remote lawyer contacted via satellite phone, I drafted an emergency legal declaration. First, I formally disinherited Brandon, removing him from my will and all financial accounts. Second, I established a private trust for Emily, locked until her 25th birthday, with stipulations for education and health care that couldn't be accessed by her parents. Third, I named a non-family executor, my longtime estate attorney, to manage all decisions. Finally, I designated myself as Emily's guardian in the event criminal charges led to her parents' incarceration. It was a cold, calculated dismantling of everything Brandon and Claire had tried to steal. No emotion, no revenge, just surgical excision of their access to what they coveted. That night, I wrote a letter to Emily, to be given to her when she was old enough to understand. I sealed it in an envelope marked with instructions that it should be opened on her 18th birthday. Inside, I explained everything: their financial manipulation, the murder attempt, my efforts to protect her. I concluded with what mattered most. None of this was your fault, and I'll never let them hurt you again. As I prepared for bed on our final night at sea, I found another note slipped under my door. This one contained a printed newspaper clipping, an obituary template with the name and date left blank. Scrawled across it in red ink, "You're still closer to the edge than you think." The old herald might have felt fear. The herald who boarded this ship a week ago might have trembled at the threat. But that man was gone. In his place stood someone harder, someone who had looked into the abyss of family betrayal and found not despair, but resolve. As the ship's lights shimmered against the Black Sea, I realized something deeper than vengeance was taking root. Not justice, not peace, control, and I was finally holding the wheel. Some endings aren't written in blood or fire, but in ink, court orders, and irreversible silence. The Ocean Serenity pulled into New York Harbor at dawn on our final day. The skyline transformed from a jagged silhouette into gleaming towers as sunlight crept across the city. All around us, passengers bustled with the excitement of return, families taking last-minute photos, couples planning their next adventures, children darting between luggage carts. Emily and I stood at the rail, watching the Statue of Liberty pass on our starboard side. She'd insisted on wearing her "I Survived the Ocean Serenity" t-shirt from the gift shop, not knowing how literal that statement was for me. "Can we come back next year?" she asked, her small hand finding mine. "We'll see," I replied, unwilling to make promises I wasn't certain I could keep. On a lower deck, away from the crowds, Brandon and Claire were being escorted through a private security route, their faces obscured as they were led toward a separate disembarkation point. Captain Reeves had arranged for them to leave the ship last, after all other passengers had departed, a small mercy I'd requested for Emily's sake. Officer Shaw appeared beside us, his uniform crisp despite the early hour. "Ready for the next step, Mr. Grant?" I nodded, feeling the weight of what was to come. As ready as I'll ever be. The machinery of justice moved with surprising speed once we returned to shore. Within 48 hours, my lawyer had filed the paperwork I'd prepared during those final days at sea, restraining orders against both Brandon and Claire, a civil lawsuit for attempted murder and elder exploitation, and a formal request for temporary sole custody of Emily. The evidence was overwhelming. The recordings, the drugged beverage, the insurance documents, the offshore accounts, Claire's hidden policy on Brandon. Most damning of all was the testimony of the ship's security team and captain, whose documentation left no room for interpretation. I hadn't anticipated how quickly Brandon and Claire would turn on each other when faced with the consequences of their actions. "I was manipulated," Claire's attorney argued during the preliminary hearing. My client was under emotional duress and coerced by her husband. Brandon exploded from his seat when he heard this. "She was the one who said we should do it," he shouted, before his own attorney could restrain him. "She planned everything." The judge, a stern woman in her 60s with eyes that had seen every variety of human deception, ordered a psychological evaluation for Brandon. Claire might have succeeded with her victim narrative if not for the private investigator's business card found in her wallet, a man she'd hired to follow me months before the cruise, gathering information on my routines and finances. Her plea deal collapsed under the weight of premeditation. A child psychologist interviewed Emily with gentle care, asking about her home life and what she understood about the situation. "Mommy and Daddy said Grandpa was going away soon," Emily told the woman, innocently revealing another piece of their plan. "They said we wouldn't need to worry about money anymore." The psychologist's report noted signs of emotional instability in Emily's home environment, a pattern of inconsistent parenting, exposure to financial stress, and subtle manipulation. When the final ruling came, it was decisive and comprehensive. Temporary custody granted to me, with a full hearing scheduled for 6 months later. Brandon denied visitation until completion of court-ordered psychological rehabilitation and financial restitution. Claire stripped of parental authority pending resolution of criminal charges. Control of all trust accounts and household decisions transferred to me as Emily's guardian. They walked out of the courtroom separately, not just from each other, but from Emily's life. In the months that followed, Emily and I built a new routine. We moved into a smaller home near the Hudson River, closer to a private school where she could start fresh. She joined a local sailing club, having discovered a love for the water, despite everything that had happened on that cruise. "I want to be a captain someday," she told me one afternoon as we watched boats from a riverside park. "But a good one, like Captain Reeves." I watched her grow stronger each week, her resilience astonishing me. Children can heal from almost anything if given safety, consistency, and love. Brandon relocated to Arizona after the divorce, bankrupt and alone. His real estate license was revoked, and his reputation in sales circles was destroyed by the public scandal. Last I heard, he was working retail jobs under a different name. Claire fared no better. 6 months after our return, she was arrested for financial fraud after attempting to forge documents to claim an inheritance from her own grandmother. Some people never learn, or perhaps can't change what they fundamentally are. Neither of them ever saw Emily again. The court made my temporary custody permanent, citing extraordinary circumstances of parental unfitness. On Emily's 18th birthday, she opened the letter I'd written on the ship, now worn at the edges from years in my safe. I watched her face as she read the full truth, not the sanitized version she'd grown up with, but every painful detail. When she finished, she looked up with eyes too wise for her age. I always knew there was more to the story. "I'm sorry," I said. "I wanted to protect you." "You did," she replied simply, folding the letter carefully. "And now I get to decide what happens next." She did exactly that. Emily chose to study maritime law at university, turning the darkest chapter of our lives into purpose. I couldn't have been prouder. On her graduation day, we returned to that same riverside park where she'd first declared her captain dreams. The water glittered in the sunlight, not unlike the ocean on that fateful cruise years ago. We stood at the edge of the same sea they tried to drown me in. And this time, it wasn't them walking away with my legacy. It was her.